It is early 1962. The Cold War has the entire world on edge. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in a tense standoff that touches every corner of the globe. But the most dangerous flashpoint is right here in the Western Hemisphere. 90 miles off the coast of Florida lies Fidel Castro's Cuba. Castro came to power in 1959 after overthrowing a dictator friendly to Washington. Within a short time, his government aligned itself with the Soviet Union. Soviet advisors arrived. Soviet weapons arrived. The fear in Washington was that Cuba could become a launchpad for communism in the Americas. In April 1961, the CIA backed an invasion at the Bay of Pigs. Cuban exiles trained by the United States landed on the island, hoping to spark an uprising. Instead, they were quickly defeated. Castro's forces captured or killed most of the invaders. The operation was a public humiliation for President John F. Kennedy. He took responsibility, but behind closed doors the military and intelligence leaders were furious. They believed Castro had to be removed before he became even more entrenched. Yet starting a war is not simple. The American people were still recovering from the Korean War. They would not support another large military action without a very clear reason. Congress would demand proof of aggression. The news media would question any sudden move. Allies around the world would hesitate unless the threat looked undeniable. Real provocation from Cuba might never happen. So some in the highest levels of government began to ask a dangerous question: what if we could create the provocation ourselves? This is the story of Operation Northwoods. In January 1962, the secret anti-Castro program called Operation Mongoose was running at full speed. It included sabotage raids, propaganda broadcasts, and even plots to assassinate Castro. But progress was slow. Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, who oversaw Mongoose, asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff for ideas that could provide a legitimate-looking reason for American military intervention. On March 13, 1962, a classified memorandum reached the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The title was straightforward: Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. The document was signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It began with careful, official language. It said that because it would be desirable to base American military action on some form of legitimate provocation, a series of deceptive and cover operations could be carried out to provoke the desired Cuban reaction. What followed was a list of specific plans, each one a staged incident meant to look like an attack by Cuban forces. Several ideas centered on the American naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which the United States still controlled on Cuban soil. The memo suggested creating a series of well-coordinated incidents around the base to make it appear that hostile Cuban forces were responsible. They could spread rumors using secret radio stations. They could send Cuban exiles dressed in Cuban army uniforms to stage mock attacks across the fence line. They could arrange for captured saboteurs to be found inside the base. They could even organize riots at the main gate with paid demonstrators. Every step would be designed to look like escalating Cuban aggression. One proposal directly echoed a famous moment from American history. In 1898, the battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. That explosion helped push the United States into war with Spain. The Joint Chiefs suggested something similar. They wrote that the United States could blow up a ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Or, to avoid real American deaths, they could use a drone vessel, an unmanned ship, and sink it anywhere in Cuban waters. Either way, casualty lists would appear in newspapers. The public reaction would be swift and angry. Another idea targeted Cuban refugees trying to escape to Florida. The plan was to load a boat with refugees, real or staged, then sink the vessel in international waters and make it look as though Cuban patrol boats had attacked and machine-gunned the people on board. Names of the supposed victims would be published. Mock funerals would be held on American soil. Television cameras would show grieving families. The outrage would build quickly. The proposals became even more extreme when they turned to operations inside the United States. The memo suggested developing a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington, D.C. This would include real explosions in selected locations, arson against symbolic buildings, and random shootings or bombings. Evidence would be planted to make it appear that agents working for Castro were carrying out the attacks on American soil. One of the most detailed and chilling plans involved a civilian airplane. The idea was to take a regular charter flight carrying American college students on spring break. At Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, technicians would prepare an identical drone aircraft, painted with the same airline colors and tail number. At a secure location, the real passengers would be quietly replaced with the drone. The drone would then fly toward Cuba. At the right moment, control would switch to remote operators. The aircraft would be detonated over the water. At the same time, forged Mayday calls would be broadcast in which the pilot blamed Cuban fighter jets for shooting them down. Search planes would later recover floating debris, seat cushions, luggage, personal items, that would seem to prove Cuban forces were responsible. The memo described the steps precisely. An aircraft at Eglin would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate. At a designated point it would switch to remote control. It would detonate over water. The search for debris would confirm Cuban responsibility. They even considered using the space program. If astronaut John Glenn's orbital flight, Friendship 7, had failed shortly after launch, they could have blamed Cuban electronic jamming or sabotage. These were not casual suggestions from low-level officers. This was an official document prepared by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, representing every branch of the U.S. military. It was coordinated, detailed, and signed at the very top. It was sent forward for approval. When the package reached the White House, President Kennedy read every page. He read about staged funerals for people who never existed. He read about bombs going off in American cities and blamed on Cuba. He read about blowing up a fake passenger plane and letting the world believe Cuban pilots had murdered civilians. He did not ask for changes. He did not look for a smaller version of the plan. He simply said no. The proposal was rejected completely. General Lemnitzer was soon removed from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs and reassigned to a command in Europe, still important but far from the center of power in Washington. The message to the military leadership was clear. The civilian president, not the generals, would decide when and how the country went to war. The Northwoods document did not disappear. It was filed, classified, and locked away. Decades passed. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before, but the crisis was resolved without invasion. Castro stayed in power for many more years. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed. The Cold War came to an end. In the 1990s, a new law, the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, forced the release of thousands of secret files related to the 1960s. Among those files was the Northwoods Memorandum. In 1997, parts of it were declassified. In 2001, journalist James Bamford published a book called Body of Secrets that quoted large sections of the document and explained its full meaning. Soon afterward, the National Security Archive made the entire memo available online for anyone to read. For the first time, ordinary people could see the words on the page. In 1962, the highest military leaders in the United States had seriously discussed staging acts of terrorism against their own military bases, against American civilians, even the illusion of shooting down a plane full of college students, to create public support for an invasion of Cuba. President Kennedy's decision to reject the plan stands out as one of the quiet but crucial turning points of the era. Facing enormous pressure after the Bay of Pigs failure, he still refused to cross into that moral shadow. Operation Northwoods was never put into action. No American ships were sunk under false pretenses. No bombs exploded in Miami streets with planted evidence. No drone aircraft was shot down over Cuban waters while the world watched in horror. But the plan existed. It was written down. It was debated at the highest levels. It was approved by the top military command, until one man said no. Today it serves as a sobering reminder. Even in a democracy, when fear and national security are invoked, leaders can consider actions that look very much like the deceptions they condemn in their adversaries. And sometimes the greatest risk to freedom does not come from an enemy across the ocean. Sometimes it waits quietly in the offices and conference rooms of your own capital. For more content like this, like and subscribe to the channel.